Hi everybody, so this is chapter 3 for anatomy. This is going to deal with all the tissues of the human body. The outline begins with epithelial tissue, so this will be divided into 3 parts. The first lecture will be epithelium, second part will be connective tissue, and the third part will be muscle and nerve. So the epithelial tissue is what we're beginning with. However, what you see here is actually a connective tissue disorder. So there is this is just an example of Marfan Syndrome. It's an example of connective tissue being everywhere in the body. So this particular syndrome affects a specific protein in the connective tissue. This protein is defective, and because connective tissue is found everywhere, the skeletal system, the cardiovascular system, the eyes, the skin are all affected. This Marfan syndrome encompasses the whole body. So if you're curious, it's a inherited disorder, and it actually tends to make people very tall, abnormally flexible, and have very long fingers. And so the danger about this abnormality or this disorder is that the connective tissues are weaker than they should be, so people can have problems with their heart and blood vessels and stroke, things like that. So let's begin with epithelium. Let's look at some pretty pictures of tissue. So this is adipose. Adipose is a kind of connective tissue, so this is known as fat. And this is a really cool picture of that. You can actually see there's 2 different tissue types here. There's the yellow circular adipocyte, that's the fat cell, and then you can see there's this meshwork of wrapping material around it. So that's another kind of areolar connective tissue that we'll talk about soon. This is lung tissue. So lung is made of epithelial tissue, thin cells, and a lot of empty spaces. So these dark spaces are going to be air spaces where obviously you breathe in and out. And then you have the blue cells. So the lungs are very spongy. As you can see, it's very airy. Spongy bone. So bone is actually considered a connective tissue. So I abbreviate connective tissue CT, so connective tissue. Bone, there's 2 kinds of bone we'll talk about very soon. This is a compact and spongy bone. The spongy bone is named so because it's obvious, it looks spongy. And in a person who is alive, all of these spaces here will be filled with red marrow. So bone marrow occupies the spaces of spongy bone. Skin. Now this is chapter 4, so we'll go through this in great detail, but generally speaking, you can see that we have a pink epidermis layer and a green dermis layer of the skin. And you can also see how the skin looks like it's going to get sort of sloughed off, right? You have these cells that are flaking off, and that's what happens. Everywhere you go, every moment of the day, there are skin cells that are shedding off of your body. And this is one way of how people can, like the bloodhounds and dogs can track your scent, because you are leaving little bits of your body, of your skin, wherever you go. Connective tissue this is one kind of connective tissue called areolar. So connective tissue is there's a wide variety of connective tissues. This one, I just want to appreciate how the connective tissue has these lines. There are these fibers that are found in connective tissue, and then there are these circular cells. So connective tissue is made of both protein fibers and also cells. Collagen. This is a good one because collagen is something we hear a lot about, especially in the beauty industry, and it's something that you can plump up your lips with, right? There are certain celebrities who put collagen in their lips. So collagen is a very tough fiber. It's a proteinaceous fiber, and it has a nice resilience and strength to it. It's found in your connective tissues, and it really makes the connective tissues strong and again, resilient. When your collagen fibers start to deteriorate with age, that's when your connective tissues become weaker, and older people tend to have problems with their joints, with the discs within their knees, because the collagen wears down over a lifetime and it's not replaced as readily. but you can see how it looks. It looks like rope. Human hair, again, a look at hair. This looks remarkably like the top layer of skin because it's the same kind of cells, epithelial cells. So you can see how the top layer here is flaking off. These are just flat, dead cells that form inside your follicle, and then they come out of your hair in a cylinder, as hair in a cylinder. Nerve fibers are very neat to look at. These nerve fibers that run through your body are very similar to your electrical cables. So you have the gray connective tissue that protects and insulates the nerve fibers themselves, and then the purple represent the nerve fibers that are inside. This is a close-up, right? We kind of switch the coloration. This outside area is the connective tissue, and then all of this inside is the actual fibers themselves. This is skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is the kind of muscle that moves your body, and it has a striped appearance to it. So in the third part of this lecture, you'll learn the word striation. So the striped appearance, you can see that we have kind of a striped pattern going on here, and those are called striations. Skeletal muscle also have a lot of mitochondria associated. So this mitochondria in pink, remember that mitochondria produce ATP. So if you have a very active muscle cell, you use it a lot, then it'll have a lot of ATP. It'll have a lot of mitochondria. All right, so those are our pictures, our introduction to different kinds of tissues in your body. Let's delve into epithelial tissue. So looking at your outline, letter A, the characteristics of epithelial tissue is letter number 1, cellularity, which means that this tissue is completely made of cells. In this image, you have one cell here next to another cell, and the entire tissue of epithelium would be another, just one cell next to another, kind of like a brick wall, or you can think of a tiled floor. So it's completely made of cells. We'll see how these cells, this tissue differs from other tissues. Other tissues they're not made of all just cell next to cell. They're going to be bound with specialized junctions. So take a look at the junctions here. So there are tight junctions. We talked about that earlier in chapter 2. There are gap junctions that keep them together. And then there's another method that epithelial cells use, which is this interlocking, this interdigitation of the plasma membrane. Let me show you an image of this. So this is an actual TEM of a bunch of epithelial cells. And you can see the border. It's not a straight line, right? They're interlocking with each other with these little finger-like projections that move. The membranes are interlocking in that way. So that's just an extra way that these epithelial cells stay together. So here's another image of something like that. Now let's look at the number 2, the word polarity. So polarity means that the two surfaces are not the same. The upper surface of an epithelial cell is very different than the bottom. So the upper surface is called the apical surface, and the bottom surface is called the basal surface. So it's not on this, the basal surface is not written on this. Okay, but that just means the bottom. And the apical surface is also sometimes called the free surface because this is the surface of the tissue that's going to face the outside or an empty space. Let me start by saying that epithelial cells, the characteristic of this kind of tissue is that it's a lining. Maybe I should have started with that, and I apologize. It's a lining. So it will cover the surfaces of everything in your body. All your organs are covered in a lining of epithelial tissue. Anything that's hollow, such as your stomach, your intestines, your blood vessels, if it has a hollow space, that hollowness is also lined with epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is always on the surface or coating a part of an organ that's going to be facing sort of an empty space. So because of that, the apical surface is called the free surface because this is going to be facing that space or the outside of an organ and then the basal surface will be attached to a connective tissue or attached to the different kinds of tissue underneath the lining. So if you look at the basal surface in your outline, it's connected to underlying connective tissues via carbohydrates and proteins called the basement membrane, or known as the basal lamina. Okay, so you see two bolded words there. So basal lamina is the same thing as basement membrane. In this picture, it shows you the gray line that I'm just now making red. That is made of carbohydrates and proteins. It's going to act like glue to anchor your epithelial cells to the connective tissue below it. Okay, let's take another look. So here again, we're taking a look at our sheet of cells. Notice that we have one cell next to another. Notice our interlocking of the plasma membranes. And then notice that we have the free surface up here, right? So this is our free surface or apical surface. The bottom of this sheet of cells is going to be attached to our basal lamina. So the basal lamina in this image is very small. It's a very thin, almost invisible layer in light blue. And then the yellow that's indicated here is connective tissue. So you're always going to have the basal lamina attaching your epithelial cells to connective tissue underneath it. And then after that connective tissue, maybe you have some muscle or maybe you have other tissues. So that's basically it. So make sure that you know the basal lamina is present anytime you have epithelial tissues to attach those tissues, that lining, to the structures below. Don't worry about the sublayers of the basal lamina. Okay, number 3, attachment. Epithelial cells attach to the connective tissue underneath. Check, right? We talked about that. Number 4, it's avascular. That means that there's no blood vessels that run through the tissue. So notice in this picture again at the top how it's just a sheet of cells. There's no room for blood vessels coming in here. That means that you can damage and lose the cells of this tissue and you have no bleeding. Okay, so it's avascular. The A means no, and the vascular means blood vessels. So there are no blood vessels. So you have no bleeding, right? So think about the lining of your cheeks, the lining of your esophagus, the lining of your stomach, your intestines. All of that, all those cells are constantly being replaced. You can scrape the inside of your cheek, you can hurt your cheek, but you never bleed. I mean, when you start bleeding, you can. But if you start bleeding, you've hit the deeper levels of tissue. But you can actually lose skin without bleeding. Think about the top layer of your skin. You can scrape your skin, you can visibly see that you've lost some skin, but you're not bleeding. This is because you're only hitting the epithelial cells that are lining your entire body. So that upper layer of skin is all epithelial cells. No blood vessels, it's not going to bleed. When you do bleed, when you hurt yourself, your skin, you've actually hit the dermis. So you've hit that underneath layer of connective tissue with blood vessels. Number 5, it's arranged into sheets or layers. So we have one or more layers of tissue here. So think about a tiled floor. You can have one sheet of tile, or you can have 2 or 3 or 4 sheets of tile piled on top of each other. That's how epithelial tissue is arranged. Number 6, it's innervated, meaning it has a nerve endings going into it. I don't have a picture of nerve endings, but nerve will go very close to but not enter the sheet of epithelial cells. So you are constantly monitored. The lining of your organs, your hollow organs, the outside of your organs, your skin, it's all monitored with a lot of nerve endings, but the nerve endings stay very close to the epithelium. They don't travel within the epithelium, because imagine losing some epithelial cells from your cheek and being in excruciating pain, right? So that doesn't happen. Let's think about number 7, regenerate. So your epithelial cells constantly replace themselves. So there are stem cells. Stem cells are cells that are regularly dividing, and they can replace dead or damaged tissue. So it's very regenerative tissue. So when you do lose some skin, your epithelium, it comes back, right? It grows back. So it's very regenerative. All right, so the functions of epithelium, again, what's number one? Physical protection. So you physically are protected from the world around you, and your organs are physically protected by this lining. It controls permeability. So if you think about the lungs, for example, or let's actually go to that picture of your lungs. So your lungs are made of epithelial cells, right? So this is a very thin cell. So maybe take a look down here. If you have substances like the air, for example, crisscrossing through, this cell layer is going to have to be the barrier for what comes in and what's out. So it controls the permeability of your lungs. If you move to the stomach lining is going to control what comes in and into the stomach wall. Your intestines are going to control what comes into the intestines. So it's the lining, the specialized lining of these different organs that are controlling the permeability. What comes into the organ, what comes into the bloodstream is controlled by the epithelium. Provide sensation. This is because our nerve endings go and monitor our lining and monitor the epithelium. So this is related to number 6 above, being innervated. And number 4 produces secretions. We'll talk about how our glands are made of specialized epithelial cells. All right, so let's take a look at our shapes of epithelial cells. All right, so looking at this slide, this is a little bit of a recap. So in this picture here, we have a layer of epithelial cells in my bracket. I can see the basement membrane or basal lamina in green. And then what's underneath my basement membrane or basal lamina? What is this? This is going to be connective tissue. Okay, so remember it goes epithelial cells, then your basement membrane, and then connective tissue. Your epithelial cells will always be the very top, your most superficial layer of any part of your body. And then it's anchored to the connective tissue by your basal lamina, right? So this is going to be your glue. It glues it to the connective tissue. All right, so let's see. Here we see a single layer of epithelial cells. Here we see multiple layers of epithelial cells. So before we get into layers, let's just take a look at shapes. There are 3 basic shapes that epithelial tissue have. So I'm looking at letter C, classification. How you name your epithelial tissue is by shape and how many layers it has. So this shape, squamous, means flat. Squamous means flat. And so from a sort of side view, you see how it's illustrated from the top. It will look like a fried egg. So you'll have sort of a fried egg appearance, right? You have an ovalish cell and the nucleus in the middle. Cuboidal cells are called because they're little cubes and their nucleus is nice and round and circular in the middle. Columnar cells are columns, right? They're rectangles, so it's kind of like a cuboidal cell got smushed, and the nucleus is also smushed. So the nucleus is actually an oval, oblong oval like that. So I want to point out to you that in your histology slides, when you start going through histology, it's very difficult sometimes to see the cytoplasm in the shape of the cell. So the shape of the cell might not show up, but what you see very well is the nucleus. The nucleus will always pick up stain. So if you see lots of round nuclei, even though you can't really make out what shape the cell is, if you see lots of round nuclei, you know they're cuboidal cells. If you see lots of oval nuclei like this, then you can say that those are columnar cells. Okay, so I'll point out some examples later, but that's one of those characteristics of each cell type. So those are your 3 basic shapes that all epithelial cells have, and then it's the layering, right? So you have either one layer of cells. If you have one layer of cells, you use the word simple. If you have more than one layer of cells, you use the word stratified. So let's take a look at, let me just draw an example. So if I had one layer of flat cells in this picture, I would call that simple squamous. Okay, so it's layer shape. I see one layer of cuboidal cells, so this would be simple cuboidal. I see one layer of columnar cells, so this would be called simple columnar. To give you a stratified, all you need is more than one layer. So if I drew some square cells here, and I drew another layer of square cells here, okay, and then here is my basement membrane, or basal lamina. This is my apical layer. Okay, then this, what I just drew, is a stratified columnar. I'm sorry, cuboidal. It's cuboidal. It's cuboidal. Okay, so this is stratified cuboidal. So anything that's more than one layer is going to be stratified. Moving back to this image here, what would you classify this picture as? It's stratified, definitely, but what's the shape? So you see here how the cells are slightly square-ish, and up here the cells are flattening out. So how do you name this layer? And the trick is always look at the top. Look at the apical surface. If the top cells are flat, then this is flat. So you call this a stratified squamous tissue, okay? The bottom layer of cells, the basal surface, the basal layer will be slightly different than the top. So always look at the top to name the shape of your cells. Okay, and then in terms of regeneration, if you have a stratified layer of cells, it's always the bottom layer, that very first layer, that will contain the stem cells and will reproduce. So this is the regenerative layer. And the new cells made will push the older cells up, and then the oldest cells will be on the top, and the oldest cells will eventually come off the body and get, slough off the body like your skin, or be lost like in your cheek or your esophagus. Okay, so that's how you name epithelium. So now we're going to move through different kinds of epithelial tissue, and we're going to talk about where you find them and what you do. So I think that I might pause it here and then start this in part 2. And this will be a 4-part lecture. So I'm going to pause.